Imagine a silent night, interrupted only by the sound of the wind passing through the cracks of a slave quarters. Enslaved men and women, exhausted after an entire day of work in the sugarcane fields, can barely rest. But suddenly the silence is broken by muffled screams coming from the big house. It is the torment of the night, the cruel ritual in which the master of the plantation chose who would be punished, under the watchful eyes of the overseer. Some were taken to the whipping post or the pillory, where the whip and shackles were already waiting. Others, however, were led to a terrible machine, built for one single purpose: to break bones, humiliate, and turn bodies into examples of pain. This torture machine did not exist only in the dungeons of medieval castles in Europe. It also found its place in the colonies, adapted to the realities of slavery in Brazil. In the slave quarters, the mere mention of this machine was enough to impose fear and silence, and this fear was not temporary. It was a strategy of power that kept thousands of men and women under control, with no chance of resistance. What you will see in this video is not just the description of a tool of torture. It is the story of how it became part of an entire system, sustained by iron chains, pillories, slave ships, and the logic of domination. But it is also the reminder that, even in the face of pain, many found the courage to resist, fleeing to quilombos and building cities of freedom in the midst of darkness. Over the next few minutes, you will learn in detail how this bone-breaking torture machine worked, who the chosen victims were, what punishments were imposed, and how the torment of the night became a spectacle of power. But more than that, you will understand why preserving the memory of these horrors is essential to prevent violence from repeating itself in other forms. Prepare yourself, because what once seemed like legend was in fact real. A reality marked by whips, shackles, iron chains, and the unbearable weight of slavery. And it is precisely for this reason that telling this story is an act of resistance. The history of torture is as old as humanity itself. Since the first empires, pain has always been used as an instrument of power, punishment, and intimidation. In the heart of medieval Europe, torture machines were built with cruel ingenuity, designed not only to wound, but to prolong suffering. Instruments such as the wheel, the rack, and the infamous Iron Maiden were used in dark dungeons, where pain became both spectacle and lesson. The logic was simple and perverse. Through fear, to rule, to control, and to silence voices that dared rise against established power. Over time, these practices crossed the ocean. When slave ships brought African men and women to Brazil chained in damp holds, they also brought the culture of violence as a method of domination. It was not enough to imprison, it was necessary to crush both physically and psychologically. It was in this context that the first adaptations of torture machines appeared in the colonial setting. In the big house where the plantation masters lived, the torment of the night was a dreaded reality. With each choice of the overseer, a body was turned into a living example of what it meant to disobey. The whipping post and pillory were already everyday punishments. The whip tore skin, shackles cut wrists and ankles, and iron chains dragged across the yards as a constant reminder of oppression. But beyond these punishments, there was the machine specifically designed to break bones. Unlike other tools, its purpose was not to kill immediately. On the contrary, it was to prolong suffering to its very limits, turning the enslaved body into a field of experimentation in cruelty. Historical records show that this machine began to be used in Europe during Inquisition trials. It was operated by pulleys and ropes, fastening arms and legs at opposite ends. As the lever turned, bones gave way, one by one, until they snapped. This practice, considered effective for extracting confessions, found fertile ground within slavery. Plantation masters adapted it as a way to punish enslaved people who escaped, resisted, or were accused of conspiring against the plantation order. It was common for this torment to take place at night, away from the eyes of the white families in the big house, but never out of the hearing range of the other enslaved people in the quarters. The screams pierced the night, echoing among walls and chains. Thus, the torture machine punished not only the chosen victim, but also everyone else who went to sleep in fear of being next. The torment of the night therefore became a collective psychological weapon. It was not only enslaved Africans who endured this torment. In Europe, the poor, beggars, and accused criminals were also subjected to the same instrument. However, in colonial Brazil, this machine took on an even more brutal character because it was inserted into a system that had already completely dehumanized the black body. For the plantation master and the overseer, it did not matter whether the victim survived or not. What mattered was the spectacle of pain and the lesson of obedience. Some foreign travelers who visited Brazil during the colonial period recorded in diaries and letters their shock at these practices. They described the coldness of the overseers who handled the instrument with ease as if it were just another tool of daily life. The pillory in the town squares was already feared, but the bone-breaking machine was feared differently because the victim could survive for days, weeks, carrying the memory of pain in their body. This ensured that everyone around remembered the price of rebellion. The origin of this practice reveals much about the logic of power. From ancient Rome to the times of the Inquisition, torture was seen as legitimate, necessary, almost institutionalized. When this mindset arrived in the colonies, it merged with the structure of slavery and created an environment where pain and discipline walked hand in hand. Torment was not only punishment, it was a pedagogy of fear, teaching entire generations of enslaved people that there was no escape. That is why understanding the origins of the bone-breaking torture machine is more than studying an artifact. It is about understanding how a system functioned, one that united slave quarters, big house, whipping post, pillory, whip, shackles, and iron chains into a single body of oppression. Everything was part of a larger mechanism designed to maintain absolute control. And yet, no matter how intense the pain, it never completely erased the spirit of resistance. Men and women fled, sought refuge in quilombos, or even while wounded, kept alive the hope of freedom. The torture machine was created to crush, but ironically, it also ignited the flame of courage in many hearts. And it is precisely after understanding these origins that we must look at the object itself. After all, how did this machine work in its details? What structure did it have? And why was it considered so effective in spreading fear? After understanding the origins of torture and how it crossed centuries to reach colonial Brazil, it is time to look closely at the object that became a symbol of pain and submission. The bone-breaking torture machine was not just a piece of wood with ropes. It was the result of engineering designed to prolong torment. Looking at it, one could not deny. Every detail had been crafted to turn the human body into a field of calculated suffering. The main structure was made of solid wood, reinforced with iron bars to withstand pressure. At each end, there were pulleys and levers connected by thick ropes, usually made of plant fibers or leather. The victim's arms and legs were tightly fastened into slots, while shackles and iron chains ensured there was no escape. A single turn of the crank was enough to begin the stretching process. First came the snapping sounds of muscles being pulled beyond their natural limits. Then, the bones, unable to withstand the pressure, slowly broke apart. With this instrument, the torment of the night gained an almost theatrical dimension. The overseer, tasked with applying the torture, turned the lever calmly without hurry, gradually increasing the tension. The goal was not immediate death, but to prolong the sensation of pain for as long as possible. The victim screamed, begged, cried, but nothing interrupted the ritual. The plantation master often watched from a distance as if observing a lesson being taught. The presence of other enslaved people from the quarters, forced to witness, turned the punishment into a collective spectacle of fear. Historical accounts describe how the tortured body remained marked for weeks. Fractured bones did not heal easily, especially without medical care. Deformed arms, twisted legs, and dislocated shoulders became visible signs of violence. Thus, even when the victim survived, they carried their body as a permanent reminder of the torment. The whip might heal in a few days, but the machine left scars that lasted forever. It is important to remember that this was not only about physical pain. This machine symbolized absolute control. The enslaved person ceased to be only a labor force and became an object, a piece of a macabre theater. The shackles binding hands and feet, the iron chains clinking with every movement, and the rigidity of the wooden frame created a scene of total dehumanization. It was the body reduced to nothing, submitted to another's will. In some versions, the machine even had separate traction mechanisms for arms and legs. This allowed the overseer to break bones selectively, sometimes in the upper limbs, sometimes in the lower ones. This variation made the torture even more cruel, as it gave precise control over the intensity and rhythm of pain. There are documents from the Spanish Inquisition describing this practice as one of the most effective methods of extracting confessions. In Brazil, it was adapted as an exemplary punishment against enslaved people considered rebellious or dangerous. In the big house, the mere threat of the machine was enough to maintain order. When the overseer whispered that someone might be taken to the instrument, murmurs ceased, eyes lowered, and fear spread like fire. The torment of the night, already known through whips and pillories, gained with this machine an almost demonic character. It was not used every day, but at strategic moments, precisely to reinforce the authority of the plantation master. Those who were taken to the instrument rarely left the same. Many could no longer work in the sugarcane or coffee fields and were relegated to the slave quarters in secondary roles, carrying their deformities as a living warning to others. Others, in desperation, sought to escape, risking the paths to the quilombos, where they might find refuge. The machine, therefore, not only punished but also fueled the flame of resistance. The sound of creaking wood, the tightening of iron chains, the cracking of bones, all of this created an atmosphere of collective terror. Some foreign travelers reported hearing such descriptions as if they were invented stories, but upon learning about the slave system, they realized these were realities far worse than they could have imagined. It is striking that despite its brutality, this machine was seen as legitimate within the colonial system. The overseer used it as naturally as he used the whipping post or the pillory. In the logic of the time, the body of the enslaved did not belong to itself, but to the plantation master. If flesh, blood, and even bones were considered property, torture became just another resource to correct or discipline. And let us not think that all this happened in complete secrecy. Although many punishments were carried out away from the eyes of the white elite, word spread. The entire slave quarters knew who had been taken, who had screamed, who had survived. The silence the next day was proof that the machine had done its job, imposing fear and paralyzing any attempt at resistance. The cruelest detail was the coldness with which these torments were carried out. There was no rush, no compassion. The overseer turned the lever as if operating an ordinary mechanism. The master observed as if managing a business. The victim, reduced to a prisoner of chains and ropes, had their bones turned into witnesses of their own fragility before an unbreakable system. Looking at this machine in detail, we understand that it was not just wood, iron, and ropes. It was the materialization of a larger system: slave quarters and big house, whip and pillory, post and iron chains. Every element was part of a social mechanism that had violence as its most solid foundation. The torture machine did not operate alone. It was part of a whole, of a logic that reduced lives to numbers, bodies to tools, people to commodities. And it is precisely from this perspective that we must move forward. Because beyond the physical structure of the machine, there was something even darker, the human suffering it caused, the crack of broken bones, the silence of the slave quarters when screams were heard, the trauma that never healed. This leads us to the next point of our journey, understanding what happened to those who were chosen to face the machine. After all, what was the real suffering of the victims whose bodies were crushed by this instrument of pain? The true horror of the torture machine was not only in its wooden and iron structure, but in what it inflicted upon the bodies and souls of its victims. To grasp the scale of this cruelty, one must imagine the moment when an enslaved man or woman was chosen during the torment of the night. The overseer would appear in the slave quarters, lit by a torch, calling out the name of the one whose bones would be shattered. The silence among the other enslaved was absolute, as if collective breath was held in fear and mourning. When taken to the big house or to a reserved space on the plantation, the victim was stripped of any dignity. Shackles tightened around wrists and ankles, and iron chains dragged across the floor, announcing their cruel fate. Once the body was bound to the machine, there was no escape. Arms and legs were stretched in opposite directions, and the first turn of the lever began the torment. Pain came in growing waves. First, the stretching of the muscles. Ligaments seemed to tear silently until the first crack of a broken bone echoed through the room. The whip, the post, and the pillory were already terrible punishments, but the machine added something different: the sound of prolonged pain, the cruel spectacle of bones breaking slowly. It was as if each click of the crank was a renewed sentence. The screams of the victims were not only of physical pain, but of absolute despair. Many begged for death, pleading with the overseer to end the torment with a final blow. But that was never the intention. The goal was to stretch suffering to its limits. The plantation master, watching from a distance, did not want immediate corpses. He wanted deformed, scarred bodies to display as warnings. Pain was the message, and the survivors became living witnesses of cruelty. The suffering did not end when the torture stopped. Broken bones, untreated, healed poorly, leaving arms and legs twisted. Many could no longer work in the fields, becoming burdens to the system. Some were abandoned to their fate in the slave quarters, while others were assigned to minor tasks, carrying forever the memory of the night they were shattered by the machine. And there was also psychological suffering. Sleeping after hearing the screams was nearly impossible. The entire slave quarters remained under a heavy silence, each person wondering if they would be next. The torment of the night punished not only one body, but all of them. It created an atmosphere of collective fear, where the sound of breaking bones echoed in the minds of those still standing. Enslaved women suffered in even crueler ways. Beyond physical pain, there was the humiliation of being exposed before overseers and masters. Many were bound to the machine as punishment for accusations of adultery, witchcraft, or simple resistance. Their suffering was double, physical and symbolic, as the female body became a territory of domination and violence. Enslaved men, on the other hand, were brought to the machine as examples of broken strength. The one who dared to escape, to rebel against the master, to refuse an order, was placed before the community as proof of what happened to the disobedient. With every scream, with every fractured bone, the master's authority seemed to reaffirm itself. To make it worse, many times other enslaved people were forced to watch the torment. The overseer would gather them around the instrument, as if it were a private pillory. The spectacle of pain had a pedagogical purpose: to teach, through violence, that there was no possible escape. Some looked away, others cried in silence, but all carried with them the lesson of fear. Travelers who witnessed these practices reported their shock at the indifference of the tormentors. While the body twisted in agony, the overseer turned the lever with the calm of someone handling an ordinary tool. The master watched with a cold stare, showing no emotion. This normalization of suffering was perhaps the most inhuman part. Pain turned into routine, horror into administration. But there was an even more perverse detail. The torture machine did not kill immediately. The torment could last for hours, and the victim survived days, weeks, or even months carrying the memory. Every painful movement reminded them of the moment their bones were broken. This chronic pain was an extension of the torture, an invisible prison that lived within the body. And we cannot forget the spiritual impact. Many enslaved people believed that the torment of the night was more than physical punishment. It was also a way to erase the soul, to destroy hope. But it did not always succeed. Even broken, some still dreamed of fleeing to quilombos, or prayed silently, believing that faith would be their last resistance against oppression. Thus, the suffering of the victims cannot be reduced only to the pain of shattered bones. It was physical pain, yes, but also psychological, social, and spiritual. It was the pain of being turned into an example, of carrying scars before others, of losing not only the body, but part of one's very humanity. And it is precisely this human dimension that we must take into account, because when we look at the victims, we understand that behind every crack of the machine, there was an entire life interrupted, a family destroyed, a future stolen. Torture did not affect only individuals, but entire communities. By understanding this suffering, we can take the next step, examining how cruelty intensified in particular ways upon women. Because in the universe of slavery, female pain took on even crueler contours, marked by abuse, humiliation, and forced silence. If the torture machine was already a terrible threat to any enslaved person, for women the torment took on even more brutal dimensions. Within the system of slavery, the female body was seen not only as a labor force, but also as an object of sexual exploitation and constant humiliation. This meant that when an enslaved woman was taken to the bone-breaking instrument, her suffering went beyond the physical and struck her dignity in devastating ways. Women were often accused of rebellion, adultery, witchcraft, or simply of failing to submit to the orders of the big house. A single gesture of resistance, a firm look, a sharp word, a refusal, was enough for the overseer to decide to punish them in exemplary fashion. And in such cases, the torture machine became a spectacle of male power against the imposed fragility of women. Bound by arms and legs, exposed before others, enslaved women endured double violence. The first was physical pain, muscles stretched to their limits, bones breaking slowly under the creak of wood and the snap of iron chains. The second was public humiliation. The torment of the night for them also meant forced nudity, the cold stares of overseers, and the indifference of the master, who observed without pity. This process had a clear objective: to reduce women to absolute silence. It was not enough to punish them. They had to be turned into examples for the others in the quarters, to show that resistance meant carrying not only scars, but eternal deformities. The whip at the post or pillory already left visible marks, but the bone-breaking machine elevated suffering to another level, destroying the body and its capacity for labor, while also permanently scarring the memory of the community. Historical accounts indicate that many of these women, after surviving the torment, were abandoned or relegated to the most degrading tasks within the slave quarters. Unable to perform the heavy labor in the sugarcane fields, they were treated as burdens, carrying the stigma of having been broken by the master's authority. This exclusion deepened their loneliness and pain, turning torture into a punishment that extended far beyond the moment and lasted a lifetime. Another cruel aspect was that many women were chosen out of personal vengeance. If the plantation master suspected a relationship or an intimate refusal, he would order the overseer to inflict punishment as a way of reaffirming his dominance. In this context, the female body became a battlefield where power, violence, and the desire to humiliate intertwined. Despite this, women also embodied an impressive force of resistance. Many of them, even after torment, found ways to fight back. Some escaped to quilombos, where they became respected leaders. Others passed down stories of courage to their daughters and granddaughters, preserving memory as a silent form of resistance. The body could be broken, but the voice and the memory remained alive. The specific cruelty against enslaved women shows how torture targeted not only muscles and bones, but womanhood itself. It was an attempt to erase any trace of identity, reducing women to mere submissive bodies. Yet, paradoxically, it was also this violence that strengthened the flame of resistance. Every woman who survived the torment of the night became a symbol of struggle, reminding others that even at the edge of pain, there was still strength to dream of freedom. When we reflect on the suffering of women before this torture machine, we cannot ignore how slavery turned femininity into a constant target of abuse. From the big house to the slave quarters, they were exploited as workers, abused as women, and punished as enslaved. The weight of carrying so many layers of oppression made torment an almost unbearable pain, and yet many resisted, turning their stories into seeds of hope for future generations. And it is precisely after understanding this female dimension that we must look at the other side. Because if women were brutally humiliated, men were also taken to the torture machine as public examples. They carried another burden, to show in front of everyone how masculine strength could be crushed by the power of shackles, the whip, and the bone-breaking machine. If the torture of women aimed to silence and humiliate, that of men had another purpose: to destroy the image of strength. In the universe of slavery, the man was seen as the greatest threat to the established order. His physical strength, his ability to lead, and his will to resist made him a prime target for overseers and plantation masters. That is why, when an enslaved man was taken to the bone-breaking machine, the goal was not only to punish him, it was to turn him into a public lesson for all the others. The torment of the night in these cases was a calculated spectacle. The overseer gathered the enslaved community, forcing them to watch the punishment. The victim, usually chosen for attempting to escape, questioning orders, or organizing revolts, was chained before everyone. The dragging of iron chains toward the machine echoed as a forewarning of the suffering to come. The silence of the slave quarters grew heavy, every glance filled with fear and helplessness. Once bound to the machine, the man was reduced to an exposed body. His muscles, once symbols of strength, were stretched to their limits. The snapping of broken bones rang out as a collective warning. No one was strong enough to resist the power of the plantation master. The whip at the post, or the lashings at the pillory, were already terrible practices. But the machine added an even more perverse element: the slow destruction of physical strength, the very thing that sustained hopes of escape or rebellion. It was common for men, after torture, to no longer be able to work in the fields. Broken limbs, permanent deformities, and constant pain prevented them from returning to their tasks. Thus, they became living examples of punishment, carrying in their bodies the mark of submission. With every limp, with every twisted arm, the others were reminded of the price of disobedience. This strategy had a devastating psychological effect. The torment of the night did not punish only the chosen man, but all who witnessed it. Fear infiltrated the slave quarters like an invisible chain, silencing murmurs of revolt and extinguishing the spark of uprisings. The plantation master knew this. Torture was not merely a show of strength, but a form of governance, a method of social control. There was also a symbolic dimension. The man, seen as the protector of the family and potential leader of resistance, was reduced to a broken figure before the eyes of women and children. This spectacle served to show that not even masculine strength could stand against the power of overseers and chains. It was like stripping away not only flesh, but also the identity of leader, warrior, man. Travelers who observed these practices reported the coldness with which they were carried out. The overseer turned the crank calmly, while the master watched from afar, satisfied to see his authority reinforced. Some described the silence that followed the torture. No one dared to speak, no one dared to meet the eyes of the punished man. Fear reigned as an invisible chain, stronger even than the iron shackles. But even in this scenario, resistance did not disappear. Many men who survived torment sought refuge in quilombos, fleeing to forests and mountains where they could rebuild their lives. Some, even deformed, became symbols of courage, reminding others that the body could be broken, but the will for freedom remained. This inner strength is an important detail, because while the torture machine sought to crush the male body, it could not completely extinguish hope. Every man who endured torment, even marked forever, proved that violence was not capable of destroying the human spirit. Nevertheless, the collective fear was real. In the slave quarters, the sound of cracking bones echoed for days. The dragging chains, the smell of blood, the muffled screams, all became living memories. Children grew up hearing these stories, learning from an early age that the machine existed to crush any attempt at freedom. The enslaved man, therefore, was targeted by the machine not only for his physical strength, but for what he represented. He was the hope of revolt, the symbol of resistance. By breaking his bones, the system believed it was breaking the very possibility of insurrection. But as we will see, fear was not confined to the slave quarters. The torment of the night, with all its brutality, was also taken to squares and public spaces, turning torture into a spectacle before colonial society. Torture was not limited to the dark spaces of the slave quarters or the cellars of the big house. On many occasions, it was turned into a public spectacle, a ritual of power staged before crowds. The post and the pillory, raised in central squares, were visible symbols of this cruel logic. But in more extreme cases, even the bone-breaking torture machine was displayed so that everyone could see and hear the suffering of those who dared challenge the system. These events were not simple punishments. They were true theaters of violence. The overseer arranged the space, gathering enslaved people and often free residents of the region. The torment of the night, which already terrified in the shadows, was there exposed in daylight under the gaze of all. The whip cracked, the iron chains clinked, and the cries of the punished echoed through the silent crowd. The goal was clear: to turn the victim's body into a message. Every broken bone, every drop of blood, every tear shed became a public warning that order could not be defied. The humiliation was not only physical, but social. The enslaved ceased to be just individuals and became lessons before everyone. Many European travelers who passed through Brazil recorded in their diaries the impact of these public punishments. They described the indifference of plantation masters, seated in chairs, watching as if attending a theatrical performance. White children were brought to witness, learning early on that power was upheld by pain, and the enslaved, forced to watch, absorbed the message that any attempt at resistance would end in torment before the entire community. The bone-breaking machine, used in moments of greatest severity, shocked by its sheer brutality. When placed in the public square, it became more than an instrument. It was a symbol of absolute domination. The overseer slowly turned the crank, prolonging the pain so that everyone could witness each snap of bone, each contortion of the body. The silence was heavy, broken only by screams of agony. The choice of the public square was not random. In colonial logic, the square was the heart of social life. There stood the church, the town hall, the marketplace. Placing the pillory and staging tortures in front of these spaces was a way to affirm that the slave order was embedded in every dimension of society. Torment was not only private punishment, it was politics, spectacle, and the pedagogy of obedience. For the enslaved, witnessing these rituals was as painful as suffering them firsthand. Each one knew they could be next. The invisible chains of fear were reinforced with every spectacle. The whip that tore flesh at the pillory or the shackles that bound bodies to the post did not punish only the individual, but the entire community. It was a constant warning. No one was free. Even so, some looked at these moments as fuel for escape. Many enslaved people, upon witnessing the brutality of the machine, nurtured in their hearts the flame of resistance. It was better to risk life on the path to a quilombo than remain prisoner to a system that turned pain into public performance. This contradiction reveals both the strength and weakness of the slave system. Torture as spectacle was effective in imposing immediate fear, but it also planted seeds of hatred and longing for freedom. Every scream heard in a public square became collective memory, passed from generation to generation within the slave quarters. Recalling these scenes, it is impossible not to reflect on the normalization of violence. Plantation masters, overseers, local authorities, all took part in this theater. And what is most frightening is realizing how colonial society accepted pain as part of daily routine, as if it were necessary to maintain order. But despite the cruelty, the echoes of resistance were always present. After each torment, after each spectacle of pain, some chose the path of escape. Others dreamed of organizing rebellions, and many found strength in silent prayers. The machine could break bones, but it never managed to completely shatter hope, and it is precisely at this point that the next chapter becomes essential. Because if on one side torture was a public spectacle, on the other it also became fuel for escape and for the formation of quilombos, free cities that arose in the midst of oppression. After all, how did those who refused to live eternally under the torment of the night react, seeking instead to build new forms of existence? As much as the torture machine broke bones and spread fear, it never succeeded in extinguishing the flame of resistance. With every torment of the night, with every shattered body, the desire for freedom was also born. And it was this desire that gave rise to one of the most powerful forms of resistance to the slave system, the quilombos. The quilombos were communities formed by escaped enslaved people who managed to flee the shackles, the whip, and the iron chains. They escaped silently, often in the middle of the night, seizing the moment when the overseer lowered his guard. Some carried only the clothes on their backs. Others, when possible, took seeds, simple tools, or even spiritual keepsakes that connected them to African ancestry. The path to a quilombo was full of dangers. Dense forests, rushing rivers, and constant pursuits made the journey nearly impossible. Many were recaptured and taken back to the slave quarters, where they once again faced the post, the pillory, and, in extreme cases, the bone-breaking machine. But those who made it became symbols of hope for those still enslaved. Within the quilombos, life took on another meaning. There, men and women ceased to be enslaved and became free people. They farmed, hunted, built houses of mud and wood, organized defense systems against attacks, and above all, regained the dignity stolen by slavery. The screams of pain from the big house were replaced by the sound of drums, chants, and celebrations of African culture. The most famous of these refugees was the Quilombo of Palmares in Alagoas, which resisted for nearly a century against expeditions by plantation masters and colonial authorities. Led by figures such as Zumbi dos Palmares, it became the ultimate symbol of resistance. Palmares grew so much that it came to shelter thousands of people, including not only fugitives from the slave quarters, but also indigenous people and even poor whites who rejected the slave order. Each quilombo was a direct affront to the master's power. The existence of these communities proved that slavery was not invincible, that there were ways to escape iron chains and the torment of the night. For this reason, expeditions against quilombos were carried out with extreme violence. When captured, fugitives were punished with exemplary brutality, the whip at the post, exposure at the pillory, and in the harshest cases, the torture machine to break bones and spread fear among survivors. But even in the face of repression, quilombos flourished. Everyone destroyed gave rise to others, hidden in mountains, forests, or along riverbanks. The memory of those who resisted spread throughout the slave quarters, fueling the hope of those still imprisoned. The idea of freedom grew stronger than fear. The quilombos also had a spiritual role. They were places of reconnection with African roots, where religious traditions, songs, and dances kept cultural identity alive. This spiritual dimension was fundamental to strengthening resistance. The body might be marked by whips or broken bones, but the soul found strength in faith and community. The impact of the quilombos went beyond the physical limits of their communities. Even those who never managed to escape found inspiration in the idea that there were men and women living free, breaking the chains of slavery. This awareness fueled rebellions, silent acts of sabotage on plantations, and small daily resistances. Thus, we see that the torture machine, despite its cruelty, was never able to stop the force of freedom. It could break bones, but it could not extinguish the courage of those who preferred to risk their lives fleeing to a quilombo rather than live eternally as prisoners of the slave quarters. And it was precisely this growing resistance that began to pressure the system. The quilombos showed that the slave order was not unbreakable, that violence had limits, that freedom was a real possibility. This reality, combined with both external and internal pressures, would open the path toward the slow process that led to the abolition of slavery. It is about this change that we must speak in the next chapter, because if, on one hand, torture and punishments shaped the daily lives of the enslaved, on the other, constant struggle, the quilombos and growing indignation began to open cracks in a system that once seemed eternal. And it was from these cracks that the movement toward abolition was born. The torture machine, the post, the pillory, the whip, and the shackles represented for centuries the cruelest face of slavery. Yet, no matter how brutal the system was, it could not sustain itself forever. The resistance of the enslaved, the quilombos spread across the land, the nighttime escapes from the slave quarters, and even the outrage of part of society began to create fractures in what once looked like an indestructible edifice. In the 19th century, winds of change were blowing across many parts of the world. European countries began gradually abolishing slavery, pressured by new ideas of freedom and by the economic interests of the Industrial Revolution. The transatlantic slave trade, long sustained by slave ships, no longer had the same strength. And within Brazil, the echoes of revolts, mass escapes, and uprisings revealed the system's growing unsustainability. International pressure was also decisive. England, which had enriched itself through the trade of human beings, officially condemned slavery and demanded that countries like Brazil follow the same path. Treaties were signed, British ships intercepted slave vessels, and the image of a slave-holding nation became a political burden. But it was not only external pressure that changed history. Inside the slave quarters, resistance never ceased. Each torment of the night fed the flame of freedom. Each body scarred by the whip or deformed by the bone-breaking machine reminded all that living under iron chains was unbearable. The muffled cry of the enslaved turned into songs, prayers, and escapes that kept alive the hope of better days. In the big house, many plantation masters fiercely resisted the idea of freedom. For them, slavery was more than labor. It was the foundation of power, wealth, and social order. But as the abolitionist movement grew, their arguments became increasingly fragile before public opinion. Abolitionist societies began to emerge in the cities, bringing together intellectuals, journalists, and political leaders. Texts circulated denouncing the cruelties, narrating the suffering of the slave quarters, describing the horror of the pillory and the iron chains. These accounts shook consciences, showing that slavery was not merely an economic system, but a moral stain impossible to justify. The resistance of the enslaved themselves was fundamental in this process. Many continued to flee to quilombos, others rebelled on plantations, and still others sabotaged their work in silence, showing that slavery could no longer be sustained. This internal pressure added to external forces and made change inevitable. The torture machine, the ultimate symbol of oppression, no longer played the same role as before. Instead of generating only fear, it became a living denunciation of a system that had to be destroyed. Each broken bone, each muffled cry, each torment of the night echoed as proof that freedom could not be postponed. In 1888, the signing of the Lei Áurea, Golden Law, represented the legal end of slavery in Brazil. But abolition did not immediately erase the scars of pain. The freed carried with them the marks of the whip, the traumas of the shackles, the memory of iron chains and nights of torment. Freedom arrived, but without reparations, without land, without the conditions for a dignified life. The legacy of slavery remained alive in the streets, in inequalities, and in the structural racism that still persists. Even so, abolition was the achievement of generations who never stopped fighting. Quilombos, rebellions, escapes, songs, prayers, all of these shaped the path that led to the official end of captivity. The torture machine may have broken bones, but it never managed to destroy the human spirit that cried out for justice. And it is precisely at this point that we must move forward. Because abolition did not erase the logic of oppression. Violence transformed, taking on new forms. If once the torment of the night and the pillory punished in public squares, today we see echoes of that violence in other social structures. Slavery was abolished, but did the suffering really end? The abolition of slavery in 1888 represented a historic victory, but it did not erase centuries of pain. The torture machine, the post, the pillory, the shackles, and the iron chains were physically abandoned, but their logic remained alive in new forms of oppression. The torment of the night gave way to invisible chains which continued to imprison entire communities in cycles of inequality, exclusion, and structural racism. When we look at the slave quarters and the big house, we see they did not completely disappear. They were transformed into modern symbols, impoverished outskirts on one side, luxurious mansions on the other. The same structure of power that once used torture to control now manifests itself in unequal opportunities for education, healthcare, and work. The echoes of slavery can be seen in the alarming numbers of violence against the black population, in the lack of representation, and in the struggles of those who inherited the weight of exclusion. If once the whip and the bone-breaking machine were instruments of submission, today prejudice and institutional racism are tools that perpetuate the same system. The invisible chains do not rattle like iron, but they are heard in silenced voices, in closed doors, in denied opportunities. They are subtle, but devastating reminders that abolition was incomplete. The black body remains marked, no longer by the wounds of the whip, but by the stigmas of a society still carrying the scars of the big house and the slave quarters. And yet, there is resistance. Just as quilombos emerged in the midst of violence, today there are spaces of struggle, culture, and identity that keep memory alive and affirm freedom. Music, literature, art, and social movements are the new drums that echo against the invisible chains. They are modern ways of breaking the shackles that history left behind. The echo of the past also teaches us that torture is not confined to the body. It manifests in looks, in silent discriminations, in inequalities that seem natural, but are not. The bone-breaking machine, though destroyed, remains alive as a metaphor for the system that seeks to crush dreams and identities. That is why remembering is resisting. Looking at the past is not an exercise in gratuitous pain, but of awareness. The memory of the slave quarters, the post, the pillory, and the torture machine shows us that every step toward freedom was the fruit of struggle and sacrifice, and that the path of abolition has not yet ended, because invisible chains continue to bind millions in inhumane conditions. But it is precisely from this memory that hope is born. If men and women resisted the torment of the night, endured whips, shackles, and iron chains, and still built quilombos and paths to freedom, then today it is also possible to resist new forms of oppression. The echo of the past calls us to transform the present and ensure that future generations do not carry the same chains, visible or invisible. And it is in this reflection that we reach the final point of our journey. Because if the torture machine was a symbol of the past, it is also a mirror of the present and a warning for the future. It is up to us to decide whether we will repeat the cycle of pain or transform memory into liberation. Throughout this journey, we have seen how the bone-breaking torture machine was not just wood, iron, and ropes. It was the reflection of an entire system, sustained by overcrowded slave quarters, by the imposing big house, by the whip that tore flesh, by the shackles that cut wrists, and by the iron chains that bound bodies and souls. The torment of the night, turned into a spectacle of pain, was the pedagogy of fear that kept entire generations of enslaved people under control. But at the same time, this history showed us something even stronger: resistance. Even in the face of torture, men and women fled, built quilombos, preserved their culture, and passed on hope to future generations. The machine could break bones, but it never fully broke the human spirit that cried out for freedom. Today, when we remember this past, it is not just to relive the pain, but to understand the present. The invisible chains that still imprison so many descendants of enslaved people show us that abolition was only the beginning. Structural racism, social inequality, and exclusion still echo as modern memories of the pillory and the post. If once torment was physical, today it manifests in denied opportunities, in daily violence, and in the silencing of millions of voices. Remembering is resisting. Telling these stories is preventing them from being erased. Every detail of the torture machine, every muffled cry in the slave quarters, every tear shed at the pillory must be preserved so that it never happens again. Forgetting is oppression's greatest ally. Memory is freedom's most powerful weapon. That is why this video is not just a historical narrative. It is an invitation to reflection. It is a call for every viewer to recognize themselves as part of this history and to take responsibility for ensuring that new forms of torment do not continue to exist. Because as long as invisible chains remain, the struggle is not over. The quilombos of the past have become the cultural, social, and political movements of today. Every act of resistance, every voice raised against racism, every initiative for justice is a new way of breaking shackles. The echo of pain can only be overcome by the cry of freedom. And here is where our story connects with you. If this video made you reflect, if it awakened in you the awareness that slavery did not end but merely changed form, then do not let this message die. Subscribe to the channel, share this content, carry this memory forward, because every person who knows the truth becomes a guardian of freedom. The bone-breaking torture machine remains in the past, but the lesson it left us is urgent. We must never allow dehumanization to take root in our society again. And the best way to ensure this is to transform memory into action, pain into resistance, silence into voice. May every broken chain be another step toward true freedom.